Hello and welcome to The Student Space, a podcast for students about high school, life after school, and how to actually be an adult. In this episode, I'm joined by Ben from the English Lab, who has over a decade of experience teaching English and also being a VCAA assessor. He shares insight and advice about the upcoming General Achievement Test, which is also known as the GAT. Enjoy! Before we jump into the chat, I want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording this podcast and pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. Firstly, just start out by telling us who you are and what you currently do.
Thanks, Maya. It's really great to be here. So my job is that I work for myself and I work with all teachers across Victoria working on their English teaching programs, essentially. So I was an English teacher for a very long time, for about a decade or so, and now I work with different schools on how they go about teaching English and their English teaching programs. And that also means that I work a lot with students as well, particularly in VCE, sort of delivering presentations and doing teacher training, but also student presentations in helping them get the most out of themselves when it comes to VCE.
Awesome. So I definitely think we are in good hands for this GAT episode, especially the writing tasks.
I hope so. Yeah, absolutely. So I've marked the GAT writing section for about the last 6 years, I think it is, and that came after I jumped into marking the English exam about 7 years ago, and I sort of enjoyed that whole process. So I got into the GAT the next year, and I've been doing it each year since.
Oh, excellent. So tell us, what is the GAT and who has to sit it?
All right, so the GAT needs to be sat by anybody who's sitting a 3-4 subject, essentially. And the reason behind that is that it is used to get an idea of who these students are that they are eventually going to use in order to, put out their study scores. Hence why it's only the students that are sitting a 3-4 subject, the Unit 1 and 2 not having a study score, they don't need that. And so there's so much to it, but I always used to think the easiest way I used to put it to my students, because a lot of times there can be that sort of laziness or that sense of, does this really matter, and all those types of things. The easiest way I put it there was that it's like an insurance policy in some regards, that if there's some reason why you can't be, working at your best when it comes to the end of year exams, that you've shown them, in the GAT what you are capable of. It's also there for them, and when I say them, I mean the VCAA, the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority. It's for them to have a sense of who you are and what you're capable of around all those different skills. And so when that comes to the writing sections, obviously it's about your written expression, your ability to think, your ability to develop a piece of writing and to be fluent and to be clear. And so with all the other skills, math, science, reading, humanities and arts and all those types of things, it's basically just showing what you can do, and it's the first external assessment that a lot of students will do for the year, and it means that then the VCAA can take that data, they can get a profile as to what they think you are capable of, they can put that against your SAC results, they can put that against your exam results, and they can, make a really informed, sort of calculation when it comes to, taking a look at what you and your cohort at your school were capable of. And taking a look at how you performed on the exams as to how they predicted you would perform, and basically keep an eye on things in that regard. So it's not something that, is super important in terms of, right, if I do really well on this, it will lift all my marks, or if I don't do well, it'll lower all my marks. It's not that direct, but it's just a good idea for you to go in there and just show the best version of yourself when it comes to all these skills.
Absolutely. And I love how you mentioned it's like an insurance policy. That's a great way to put it, because yes, we may feel that we are invincible, but you just never know what might happen. We might get sick. We might not be able to sit the exam. We can't predict the future. So it's fun.
Absolutely. And there's always that, it'll never happen to me, but, lots of these things happen to people, when it comes to exams. So you want to make sure that if that does happen, that you could look back at your performance on the GAT and say, well, that was a true indication of who I am and what I'm capable of.
Absolutely. So now tell me, what's it made up of? I do know it goes for 3 hours, so that could be quite scary for students. But what do we do in that 3 hours? What sections are there?
So, and yeah, you're right with it being the 3 hours, which is, a very long exam. And so it's a really good way for students to sort of dip their toe into the exam experience and say, right, I'm going to have to focus for that amount of time. the way it's set out is that there are 2 writing sections to start off with. And so when we dive into those later, I'll explain them in deeper depth. But there's writing task 1 and writing task 2. It's written on there that it's advised that students spend 30 minutes on each of those, so an hour in total. And then there is 70 questions in the multiple choice section, which there's 2 hours allocated for that. And so students will often ask, oh, okay, am I allowed to spend more than 30 minutes on one of the writing tasks, or, less than 2 hours, or things like that? There's not going to be anyone sort of standing over their shoulder saying like, right, it's 30 minutes, you have to stop writing that now, or anything like that. You're just given those guidelines as to this is how long has been allocated for this task. Doesn't mean that there's anyone there, sort of wrapping you over the knuckles if you go to 31 minutes on one of the tasks. So, that's the order that they appear in: writing task 1, writing task 2, and then the multiple choice questions.
Awesome. So for anyone listening, you can take 30 minutes for writing task 1. You could take 35 or 40, but it's just a matter of managing your time to make sure you finish all sections within the 3 hours.
Absolutely. And with that, sometimes I don't know where it's come from, but students will often say to me, oh, writing task 1's worth more than writing task 2, right? And that's just not true. They're both allocated, 30 minutes. So, if you do have that extra time and so on, it's obviously, better for you to spend more time on things. But I definitely wouldn't be spending more time on one task, at the expense of another. I'd be making sure that I'd split that out and manage my time nice and evenly.
Absolutely. So now let's do a deep dive into each section. So we'll start with writing task 1. What information are we given, and then what do we have to do with it?
Yeah, so writing task 1 is, it's the only part of the GAT that's in colour. So it'll be the first thing when students open up the actual material, which is like a small little book, because there's so many questions in the GAT. It'll be a 2-page spread that they'll open up to, and they'll see all of this information that's placed there in front of them. All of that information will all pertain to one general sort of topic. So, for example, in the 2020 GAT, it was all about cars. And so it had, a photo of Melbourne before there were cars, horse and carts and so on. It had information about, the future of travel. It had quotes from travel experts. It had, pictures of children playing with toy cars. And, in years before that, it's been about things like Mars exploration, or about, coffee and how coffee is grown, and the different types of coffee and where it's imported, and the social impact that coffee has, and all these types of things. So each year there's a general sort of a topic, and all the information falls under that umbrella of that topic. And the information comes across in a range of different ways. And it's really important that students think about what they're being assessed on, because it's not just, okay, read this passage and then tell me what you think about it. There is obviously some written, language in there that they have to read and understand, but there's a lot of visual information that's there as well. So there's photographs. There's sometimes some photographs with some elaborations or dot points and so on underneath them. There's often something that will, test their ability to, interpret scientific or mathematical data, and it's never anything, way too extreme or anything like that. It could be a simple bar graph that has a trend. It could be a map. It could be all sorts of different things where information has been put to students in a different way. And so with all that information there, what they're expected to do is to take in what all of that information is saying, and then put it down on paper in their words in a way that shows how well they've understood it. And so it's really important that students do more than just copy the material, because, if it's got dot points and so on, the job is not to say, oh, okay, I read that, now I'm going to write it word for word exactly what it said. Sometimes I think when students aren't feeling confident with it, they can also just observe the material, which means that they'll just say something like, there is a picture of a man, doing this, or on the left page there is that, and that's not an effective way to go about it either. That's just explaining it. It's more there for the students to be able to say, right, I noticed this, and I noticed that there was a quote that really was saying this, and I'm going to put this information together and put it in really well-structured paragraphs.
Do you think students should take all this information and structure it like a Wikipedia, so in a way that flows, that makes sense? Say if there's like a timeline, would you do it in order? Do you need like topic sentences, different paragraphs? How do they structure it?
That's a really, really important thing to think about when preparing for writing task one, because there are many different ways to go about it. There's not a sort of a one size fits all sort of an answer to it. The main thing that's important is that when students look at the criteria, they'll notice that it says one of the things they're being assessed on is their ability to organise the material, and so. For me, that really means, their ability to sort it out into different paragraphs rather than it just being this big chunk of text that they've written down and that being something like, okay, I read all this and now I'm just going to put it down on paper. The ability to say, right, I've read this, I've seen those things, I've understood them, and I can put them into different categories. And each of those categories will have its own paragraph dedicated to it. So therefore, it's a really well organised, effectively communicated, piece of writing. So I'd be encouraging students, and when I, work with students on this task, it's about saying to them, right, find the links that exist between the material. Look at one of the pieces of data and then look at one of the pictures, and then if you put them together, what conclusions can you come to? What can you realise when you put two or three of the things together? What's the overall link that exists between them? And the more that students look at previous years' GATs, the more that they'll see how the VCAA have put those things down. They're not looking to trip you up or anything like that. They've put information in a very deliberate way so that there are links there for you to find, and so you can discuss those things together.
Gotcha. On the 2-page spread with all the pictures and some graphs and some statistics, let's say there's 12 or 13 pieces of information. Do I have to include all 12 of those bits of information, or can I focus on 5 or 6 perhaps?
It's a really good idea to cover as much of it as you can. You want to make sure that by the time you've finished writing your piece, you've shown a comprehensive understanding of what the material's saying as a whole. In saying that, if you've done a really, really good job of covering, say, like you said, there were 13, elements, there on the page. Say you've done a really good job and you've used 11 or 12 of the elements, it's not going to matter that you've left out one. The only time it's going to start to matter is if you start to look and you think, oh, well, I didn't mention that, or I didn't mention the picture, I didn't really talk about that graph or that dot point. All of a sudden, when you start to list 3, 4 things, you're really starting to be limited in how far you can go because you haven't shown that overall understanding of the main information in the material. So the answer to that lies in you want to be as comprehensive as possible, but don't panic thinking that the assessors are sitting there with a checklist thinking, oh, yeah, this is an excellent piece, but there was this one tiny little thing that was neglected. It's looking to do as much as possible and cover the main information in the material, which will mean that you'll have to cover at least, sort of 85, 90% of it.
Absolutely. And so you did mention not restating what we see or restating, but what if there's a statistic? Can we just restate it, or how should we embed it creatively or succinctly?
Yeah, that's there's times where I know, like I'll go and I'll speak to students about it, and I'll show them a sample piece that I've written, and I got caught up once because I'd said to them, look, I don't want you just to copy it. And the thing that I was referring to was a dot point, and I'd written nearly word for word what had been said. And this student said, hey, you told us not to do that. And so my answer to that was, occasionally you are going to find yourself writing either very similarly or, a sentence that is the same. So long as you go on to do something with that information after you've written it nearly word for word, that's fine. There's going to be certain stuff that's written there that you can't put into other language, and that's okay, and that's understood.
Okay, so my next question is, what if the particular topic, for example, last year was about cars? What if my general interest actually includes cars? Can I include anything from my general knowledge into writing task number 1?
Unfortunately, Mia, that would be irrelevant. What you walk into the GAT with before you sit the GAT in writing task 1 is irrelevant. It's not about what you know about the topic beforehand when it comes to this. It's about your ability to synthesize or process the information that's there on the page. So be really careful not to get caught up in, I'm really into this topic or anything like that. Just make sure that you're working within the parameters of, okay, they've put this information in front of me and it's my job to take it all in, pretend like I've known it my whole life and put it back down. Putting in other irrelevant information doesn't help in any way, shape or form because it's not doing what the task is asking.
Okay, that's really good to know, especially if we did get a topic which we have no idea about. It's like a clean slate for everyone in year 12.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the good ways to really think about it. In that, no one's at any advantage. If it's about some obscure topic, or it's about like fly fishing or something, it doesn't mean that those who are really into fly fishing and think, oh, I can say all this stuff that other people don't know. It's not a knowledge based thing. It's about that ability to synthesize.
Absolutely. And lastly, any final tips for task 1?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I think the main thing, and I'd say this about both of the tasks, take a look at the previous year's material. It's often said that you can't study for the GAT, and I agree with that. There's no dot points or study design to follow or anything, but you can prepare for it. So, taking a look at the last 2 or 3 or 4 years of that writing task material with writing task 1. And so when I'm talking about cars and Mars and coffee and smell and hearing and all those different things they've done, and you're looking and they're going, oh, that's what he was talking about, or, that's how it was. Just so that when you walk in for your year's GAT, you're sitting there going, okay, I get it. It's pretty similar to other years, but instead of a graph, they've got a map, or instead of a map, they've got this, or instead of a quote, they've got song lyrics, or whatever it might be. So that way you're feeling confident about your ability to do it. I think that would be the main thing. And the other main tip is, I'm really keen on making sure that I don't come across as saying to students, do it this way and don't do it this way or anything like that. But a lot of students will ask me, what about writing creatively? And it is true that, yes, you can write creatively on the GAT. That's something that you can do if you want. But, it's true insofar as you can also go in there and write nothing if you want. You're allowed to do anything, really. So writing creatively, I just say to students, if you're going to do it, make sure that you're fully aware that it's going to help you do a really good job of the task. It's really difficult to do writing task 1 in a creative fashion, in my opinion. So that's purely how I see it. That's not a view of, all the assessors or anything like that. I just think that often what I see when I'm working with students in preparing for the GAT is that they'll try to write a creative piece in half an hour. It's very hard to set up a creative piece, in the context and character and setting and all that stuff within half an hour. And it's very easy to get sidetracked and start doing all these other things to make sure you've written this fantastic creative piece when really you weren't being assessed on that. You're being assessed on your ability to process the information and present that. So, I want to be really clear in that and saying, I'm not saying don't do it and you're not allowed or anything like that. But, you'd want to be really sure, because it can be one of those things that can really sidetrack students.
Thank you. Some great tips there for task 1. But now let's do a deep dive into task 2. So again, another writing task. What are we presented with? And what do we have to do with the information?
Writing task 2 is going to put 4 statements in front of you. So it's a really bland piece of paper that has 4, they look like speech bubbles, just 4 rectangles. And it will just be 4 distinct points of view. And again, they'll all have a thread or a theme or a link that exists between them. So in previous years, it's been like the conflict that exists between privacy and security. So there'll be a couple of points that are saying, we should never give up our privacy for the name of security. And there'll be things saying the opposite, saying, security is more important, and for us to have a safe life, we have to, give up certain privacies or something. So that was one of the ones from, about 4 or 5 years ago. In other years, it's been about, like the difference between work and relaxation. It's often a way of looking at something and saying, right, here's an idea, here's something that exists in our lives and the way we live our lives, and here's 4 ways of thinking about it. What do you think? And the really important part there that students will see in the criteria, it says the extent to which you can develop your point of view. So it's really asking students to develop their own point of view, not talk generally about it, but rather look at the material that's been put in front of them and think, well, what do I think about this? What's my view on this? And that's where they should be, launching off from to write their writing task 2 piece.
Awesome. So we've been given 4 prompts, perhaps. Do we have to use all 4 in our response, or can we pick 1 or perhaps just 2 of them?
So it will say in the criteria, based on 1 or more. And so it really is up to each particular student with how they feel about going about it. there's no advantage. And I've sometimes said this to students, and I think sometimes they think like I'm hiding the real answer, like there's a wink and a nudge, like, oh, do it with 4, it's the best way, or something like that. There really is no advantage. It's a case of looking at them and thinking, oh, actually, I feel very similarly to the first statement, and I could perhaps use the second statement as a bit of a rebuttal because I really disagree with that, or I vehemently disagree with the third statement, so I'm going to dive in and argue against that. But really, it's about being inspired by the 4 statements, in looking at them and then thinking, right, where do I sit on this issue? And I always point out to students that there's 4 statements, not 2, because it's not this sort of tribal, black and white, yes or no, sort of, you must think this way or you must think that way. They'll notice that the 4 statements are very distinct in what they're saying and very, clear in having a distinct point of view. Students should be looking to have that as well. So whatever the issue might be, whatever people are arguing about, it's not about jumping in the camp of one side of it and dismissing all other thoughts. It's about saying, right, when I think about this and the ways that it can be seen, this is where I land on it and this is how I feel about it. So there really is no advantage in using all 4 or 3 or 2 or just one of them. That's just different ways of going about it. The one thing to really make sure that you avoid with writing task 2 is that some students will put all 4 of the stimulus, sentences in there and then just respond briefly to all 4. And that just means that you've got like 4 points of view that you've sort of half touched on, and that's a really unsophisticated way to go about it. Arrive at your own point of view based on what's been written there.
Gotcha. And now we don't need to state which stimulus we're responding to. We don't have to say, I'm responding to number 1.
No, absolutely not. And sometimes students like to start their piece by copying one of the stimulus, sentences, word for word, which, it's not the worst thing to do, but at the same time, you don't have to do that. And I can understand why students get a bit caught up in that because, in VCE English, we're saying things like, answer the question, make sure you answer the question, or with the comparative, make sure that you're using what the comparative question is putting to you and da-da-da. Whereas with this, as long as your piece is in response to that overall issue, it's completely fine. So you don't need to state, I think, like number 3. It's little bit like writing task 1 there, where you don't want to be saying things like in the graph or there is a picture of or anything like that. So you don't want to be saying, I agree with the 4th statement. You just want to be, jumping off from the point where it's like, okay, having looked at all of them, this is where I sit.
And now you mentioned it's all about persuading and giving our own opinion on a stimulus. Should we be using persuasive devices within it, like rhetorical questions, anecdotes, all those types of things?
Yeah, it can be a really good idea to do so. If that's part of developing your point of view and it helps you do that in a more sort of resolute way, then go for it. But I'd be advising students, don't get too caught up in thinking, again, that there's some sort of checklist or that there's, these sort of technicalities like, okay, you must use X amount of persuasive devices or anything like that. It's just about putting your point of view forward in a really clear and coherent manner. So that doesn't mean that you have to use rhetorical questions or emotive appeals or any of those types of things, as long as you're being clear and distinct in exactly what you're saying.
Cool. And does it matter what person we write in? Should I write in first person or should I adopt a persona, or it doesn't matter?
No, so it's completely up to the student. Again, there's no right or wrong way to go about it. Sometimes when I speak to students about it, I'll give them examples that I can remember where students will put themselves and their own experiences into it. Because for some students, injecting their own personality into their writing is how they write best. It's how they can be authentic and genuine in their voice and really standing out and writing a really, effective piece. Some students look at that and think, oh, gosh, that's the last thing I want to do. I really don't like injecting myself into my writing, and that's completely fine. If a student's sitting there thinking, well, actually, I'm going to be able to develop a point of view, best when I stand back from an issue and just point out really well thought out, insightful, intelligent, sophisticated arguments that I stand back from and just put out there in this very sort of clear way, well, then that's the best way to do it for that particular student. Someone else might think, well, I want to get in there with my personality and show how I see the world and things like that. And that's how I'm going to be really, clear in what I'm saying and have a real sort of genuine voice.
Awesome. Cool. And my last question for writing task 2 is, unlike writing task 1, can we put our own general knowledge into this? And this does touch on what you just mentioned. Can we give, I don't know, a great example or a statistic? Can we pop that in?
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. So, the next step after you've sort of thought, well, actually, this is my point of view on this issue or on this way of thinking, you have to think about, well, how am I going to frame that? What arguments, what am I going to use in order to help me get that idea across? And so you are not just encouraged to, it's not just, oh, you can do it, you should do it. You should be using your view of the world. And one of the really interesting things about that is that it can really be about what we see. And this isn't a black and white rule or anything, but just generally what I tend to see is that students who can show thinking about the world outside of themselves tend to be the ones that end up showing more insightful thought and a more developed point of view and perform better on this. So I want to be really clear in saying that's not like, the silver bullet, like once you start talking about other people, bang, you're instantly going to get a good mark. But having that sort of depth of thinking about, okay, this is what I feel and this is how I can show my understanding of the world and people other than me and why my point of view is valid and so on, often leads to that more insightful, in-depth sort of thinking that can take us a lot further.
Awesome. Thank you. And now I know we touched on time management, but do you have any tips on managing time? Is it just as simple as smashing out these writing tasks one after the other, or doing multiple choice first? What's your game of attack?
Yeah, I think, like with anything, it's about being prepared and knowing what's coming so that you can make decisions that are there for you. I know certain students will say to me, I've heard that the 70 multiple choice questions don't actually take 2 hours, and a friend of mine did it last year, and they finished their writing tasks early within half an hour each. And then, they had heaps of time left at the end or something like that. And other students say they didn't have enough time. So it's going to be, completely up to each individual student. I have heard people saying, I'll do the multiple choice questions because once they're done and you can't change, you can't really go back and make an answer more correct or anything like that if you think you've got it right. Whereas with, the more time you have with your writing, the better you can do. Personally, I would think that if I've just been, using all my, knowledge and effort and all that stuff on doing multiple choice for 2 hours, to sit down and write a half-hour piece and then another one, I'd find that pretty exhausting. I'd like to get the writing done first because it's that thing where you have to focus on it for the longest amount of time. But that's just, that's just me and how I would feel about it. I would think that, you've been given that time because that's what they think, the average student is going to take. So I would be doing it the way it's done there in the book. I'd be taking that half hour for each of the writing tasks. It's understood when these pieces are marked that you only had a half hour to do them. You don't have to write like a perfect introduction and a perfect conclusion and have this essay that's all, wrapped up in a bow and everything like that. It's understood that it's a half-hour writing task, so just get in and do the job and then, worry about it from there.
Absolutely. And there's no particular word count requirement or you have to do X amount of pages. It's just whatever you get done in the 30 minutes, right?
Yeah, so there's nothing that says that, you can't get a certain score if you don't write this amount of words or anything like that. In saying that, what you'll find is that obviously because they have to, rank the pieces and so on, the very top marks will be reserved for those students that not only do the job, but do so in a way where they've used sort of introductory-like language in the opening of their piece. They've summed up their pieces really nicely. They're comprehensive in how much they've covered, and often that will lead to, a longer word count and so on. So it's not a case of, all right, more words equals higher marks or anything like that. But, it does have to be understood, of course, that, the students that are really being comprehensive in the way they go about it and using all the material in writing task 1 or using a range of arguments and ideas with writing task 2 are giving themselves that best opportunity to climb that ladder in the rankings.
Absolutely. So that wraps up task 1 or writing task 1 and writing task 2. So let's chat now about the multi-choice section. So multi-choice, there are 70 questions. What are the requirements? What can we expect from them?
So it covers basically everything else other than writing. So there's scientific thinking and mathematical abilities, and there's, arts and humanities based questions. So about interpreting, cartoons and interpreting political cartoons or artworks or photographs or write, you've got to read, certain passages of writing and interpret those things as well. So there's a whole range of skills that's going to, test, your understanding of all those different, disciplines, I guess, of how we can think and how we can work things out. So from the very sort of technical problem solving based sort of skills all the way through to the more abstract sort of, okay, we've read a passage of literature and now we have to answer questions based on how we've, read and understood it.
Absolutely. And I know math, science is not your forte, but in terms of like the passage, English type of questions, do you have any tips for nailing them? For example, shall we read the questions first and then the passage, like, your classic example?
Yeah, I think there's a set of strategies that you can follow no matter what the question is. And the first thing I would be doing would be to make sure that I can, have a think about what I think the answer might be, straight off the bat, and then look to erase any answers that I know are incorrect, and I know from, looking through the GATs of previous years that sometimes I'll look at it and I'll think, I don't know the answer to that. I can't be 100% confident, but I know that it's not D, for example, or whatever it might be. And working that way can be a really good way of improving your chances. Sometimes even if you don't know the answer, you might know what it's not. And that might improve your chances from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3, maybe even 1 in 2. From there, I think as well, it's important to have a think about, how can I make the best guess at this? If I don't know the answer straight out, what is it that I can look at that might be able to help me with it? And one of the odd things that pops up, particularly with the reading questions and sometimes with some of the others, sometimes it's the most correct answer. And that's a bit of a weird one to put forward, that idea that it's the most correct. But you'll realize sometimes that you'll be going through, some of the questions and you'll be thinking, oh, well, it could be B, but it could also be C. Like sometimes it'll appear like there's 2 right answers. Well, which one's the most correct? Which one has the most evidence supporting it and so on, particularly for those more abstract things. Be aware that there are going to be questions that you're going to look at and think, well, I could see that being B or C. Well, often when you're thinking that, a lot of other students will be thinking the same thing. The question's probably designed that way, but there'll be something that you'll be able to look at and think, oh, actually, even though it could be B, it's definitely C because of these reasons. And like you asked about with going back and rereading the material and so on, it's really, really important for with the reading ones to make sure it's not a memory game. It's not a memory test like, oh, okay, you've read this passage, now answer these 5 questions. It's not about, okay, well, I read it once, so I'm not allowed to go back and reread it. You'll notice with the reading ones, they'll have numbers in brackets that'll point you back to the line from the passage that it's on. So they're essentially saying to you, on line 7, when the character said this, it's essentially saying to you, go back and read line 7 and the line before and after it, and then come back with a good idea of this question. So with the reading ones, I'd be approaching it in read it yourself the first time, read the first question, think to yourself what the answer might be, look at what all the possible answers are, go back and reread the part of the passage that they've directed you to with the knowledge of what the questions are, and the answer should pop out to you then. When I say should, I probably should use a better term than that, because that would imply that everyone should always get the right answer. That's not going to happen. But that's giving yourself the best chance of saying, right, this is where I'm going to be for where I can get, the answer that I think it'll be.
Definitely some great advice there. And I just want to highlight to students that the multi-choice is only out of 4. You've got A, B, C, and D. And that's unlike some other exams which you will have at the end of the year, which might have an option E. So it's quite good that we've got one less option, that if you are guessing and finding the most correct one, you have a better chance if you're knocking out either 2 or 3 or like 1 or 2 options as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, there's been certain schools that I've visited in the last couple of months, and they've been doing practice GATs and so on. And I've sort of noticed a bit of a trend with students that feeling a bit down about themselves or feeling like, oh, I'm not that intelligent and stuff because the GAT was so hard, or there were certain questions and they'll say things like, oh, I must be stupid because, like question 33, like I wouldn't even know how to do it. I didn't even know what the answer might be, and all those types of things. Don't be dispirited. The GAT is really tough in certain sections. I know, way back when I was a bit younger, I was a bit cocky. I sort of stood up in front of the year 12s that I taught, and I didn't really plan the lesson. I was like, oh, we'll just do question 24 together. Everyone turned to question 24 of last year's GAT. And I got halfway through it and I realised I don't know the answer to this. I can't work it out. It's really tough. And some of those questions are really hard. So the way I think that's always worth remembering for students that, there's tens of thousands of students because you've got the year 11s as well. It's not just sort of like the 45,000, year 12s that are sitting it. You got tens of thousands of students and they're trying to discern who is at, the very sharp end of some of these skills. The only way they can do that is by asking questions that maybe only 10 or 15% of the state are going to be able to answer. So if you're looking at going, I don't even know how you'd answer this, chances are 85% of the state are thinking the same thing. So don't be dispirited by some of the questions being really hard. One of the things I'll say to students, I'm like, if you come to me after the GAT and you say that you're confident you got all 70 out of 70 right, like I'll buy you lunch, because I don't think there'll be many students that will. It'll be a very, very small number.
Absolutely. And it's worth reiterating because a lot of students are always aiming to get 100 out of 100 for multi-choice and forgetting a high score. So the GAT's not designed to get it all right. It's designed to be challenging and to only get most of it or some of it. Especially if you are, say, a maths brain, you could go through and find all the maths questions quite easy and accessible. But when it comes to the humanities or the analysing the passages, you might find that a bit challenging. So there are different parts where you can definitely play to your strengths.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, everyone's going to be challenged by different parts of it, and some of us are going to be more challenged by more of it, or less challenged by less of it. It's going to be all those things. Just keep going through it and putting your best foot forward, and that's the best you can do.
Absolutely. So now I've just got a few other random questions. So what if I just bomb out of the GAT and I just have a bad day and I don't do well, but I do really well on my end of year exams? How does that play a part?
Well, I would imagine that's not going to have a huge impact in terms of, well, you got lucky in that you did it the right way around. I guess it's better to have bombed the GAT and do well in the exams than the opposite. Because essentially, what that'll be is that they'll look at your exam scores and they'll say, right, this is what this student could do for us on that day, and we'll put it with their SAC score and put that out there. They're not going to look at it and say, oh, but hold on, maybe it's not that good because of the GAT data. It's not going to work that way and have that sort of tangible impact on a score. So in also saying that, sometimes when I speak about the importance of the GAT with year 12s, like one of the common questions, I can tell who didn't really try hard when they were in year 11, because I'll go, does that mean they can look at my last year's GAT? No, the year that you sit the GAT in is the year that they will use that year for your 3-4 score of that particular year, and then they wipe the slate clean, and next year when you're in year 12, it's all about how you go on the GAT of that year. There's no sort of culmination of it or sort of aggregate score or anything like that.
Perfect. And so will my GAT ever help me bring my mark up? So if I perform really well on the GAT but not so well on my VCE end of year exams, will it get matched? Will it get remarked? How does it work?
Not in an outright tangible way that I know of, in terms of they say, oh well, maybe you just had a bad day, we'll just bump it up because we see that the GAT, the student's GAT data was good. But I can tell you that in my experience as an English assessor, that I'll sometimes be asked to get involved in what's called fourth marking, and what that means is that when all the marking has been completed and all the marks have been allocated to students, they'll take a look for where there's any, really big discrepancies between how students were predicted to perform, their predicted performance, their expected performance, and their actual one. And so that's an added safety measure. So essentially what that really means is that it takes out any way of a student thinking, no, there's no way, I didn't score well on that section of the English exam. I must have just got, 2 or 3 dodgy assessors who all got it wrong, because if there is that huge discrepancy, it will get put forward to be marked again, and that's why they call it that fourth marking, that it might be the fourth time that that's being read, and it's an experienced assessor who takes a look at it. So again, it's a bit of that insurance policy. So I guess in that very, very, very specific scenario, if you've done really well, and I'm using English as an example because that's, as far as my experience takes me with these things, you'd have that example of if you were to do really well in say, the writing sections of the GAT and so on, and then something were to happen where you somehow got two examiners that perhaps didn't give you what it was worth and so on, in that very specific scenario, it might be there to help you out.
Awesome. Well, it is good to know for anyone that was wondering. I was also going to ask you about, can we annotate on the GAT papers? So can we annotate the booklet, the multi-choice questions to help us maybe do a bit of a plan?
Absolutely. Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, draw all over them if you want to. Maybe your year 12 coordinators won't be happy because they might want to use them the next year, but don't use that as an excuse not to do it. You're more than entitled to draw all over them and write your plans and do your things that are going to help you out. So long as you're not doing it in reading time, so long as you wait until it's time for you to pick up your pen, then absolutely you're more than able to draw all over it.
One of my students actually asked me this. They said, if we're in a Victorian lockdown for the GAT, is it extended or do we have to sit it online? What will happen?
I have no idea at the moment, Mia. I think, they could probably put that question to James Molino and so on at the moment. I'd take a guess that maybe even he doesn't know what they're going to be doing just yet. So I think, students have shown that they've been really adaptable to all these different changes that have been happening. So at the moment, with Victoria being in lockdown, I don't think anyone can say with any certainty, it definitely will be over by this date or we'll definitely be in school by June the 9th. I think it's just going to have to be something that students are going to have to roll with and try their best not to get too stressed out about it. I think it's a case of, when whatever decisions will be made, worrying about it or speculating as to what they're going to do before they do it isn't really going to help that decision be made, and remembering that if they're feeling like, oh God, this uncertainty is really difficult to deal with, yep, it is, and that's fine. But it's also remember that we're all in the same boat in that regard. In that if you're finding it unsettling or you just wish there was a bit of certainty, well, there's everybody else is going through that same stuff as well, which doesn't always make it easier, but it's just something to keep in mind, I guess.
Absolutely. And so in preparing for the GAT, we don't have to do extensive practice and drills and writing a billion essays, but what can we do just to prepare? I understand we can, in preparing, know what's going on and know what to expect, but anything else we could do?
I know that a lot of schools will ask the students to do a writing task, and I think that's a really good idea to do, at least one of one writing task 1 and one writing task 2, and I've at least done both of them once. I think, like with all things, it's about that balance. And so, if I was going into the GAT as a student in 2021, I'd want to feel confident. I'd want to feel like, okay, I know what it's going to be like. So I would have wanted to have done, the exercises that are going to be on the GAT, but before I go in there. In saying that, like we said, that difference between preparing and studying, it's definitely not worth, getting completely frazzled over and, staying up till 3 a.m. and writing all these writing pieces and doing all these multiple choice questions or trying to preempt what might be on the GAT or anything like that. It's just that way of going, look, I know the format of it. I know how it's going to be. I'm prepared for it. I've tried a couple of the writing tasks. I've looked at previous years, so I know the type of questions that they ask. Some of those multiple choice questions as well, it can be good just to go through those to think, okay, so there's a reading one, and then there was this science-based one, and then there was this. So I get the way that it's going to be put down so that when you're sitting the GAT, you're thinking, okay, this is what I expected. But I definitely, just like with the results from it, it's worth taking seriously, but it's not worth getting really stressed out over. It's worth preparing for, but it's not worth, spending hours and hours and hours trying to preempt what might be on it, for all those types of things. So finding that healthy balance that exists in between, I think, is really important.
Definitely. Great advice there. And the last thing before we wrap it up, I want to chat to you about the GATch phrase, if you've heard of it. So on social media, on Facebook groups, a lot of students will try persuade other students or a big group of students to mention a particular thing or a particular idea in the GAT. Are examiners aware of this? And if they find students are doing it, do they get marked down?
Assessors are aware of it, most definitely. It's something that took me by surprise the first year. I think the first year I started marking the GAT was like 2015, I think, and it was something like...
that was my...
Oh, there you go.
Chappelle Corby?
Yes, and then there was also...
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, Shannon Knoll being robbed in Australian Idol or something like that. And I wasn't aware of it, and I was reading one of these pieces, and it was this really intelligent point of view being put forward, and then it turned and it said something like, sometimes life's unfair, like Shannon Knoll being robbed in the season of Australian Idol. I thought, what is going on? And the rest of it was really good. And so I thought, okay, that's fine. And then about an hour later, I came across this Shannon Knoll again, or it was Cat in the Hat or something like that. I'm getting all the years mixed up. And so that's how I learned about it. The assessors are aware of it. It is pretty funny. I'm sort of getting on a bit now in age as well. I'm getting a bit older, and I've found myself, people going, have you heard of this GATch phrase and stuff like that they bring up? And often the times, particularly if it's something that's on like TikTok or something like that, it's something that I haven't even heard of. I might ask, certain teenagers that I'll know, I go, what's this thing? Yes, it's there. It's a bit of fun. Look, it's not something where there's like a black and white rule that says, oh my goodness, if you see any one of those kids using that, that stupid catchphrase, mark them down or anything like that. It doesn't work in that regard. Some students might try so hard to get something like that in there that they actually won't be doing the task that they're trying to do. So inadvertently, it really will limit how far they can go. If you've written this excellent piece that's super well organised and really well done, and you've got some little cheeky throwaway into it that doesn't really detract from it, it's not going to be, in my opinion, the difference between, oh, right, well, it was all going well until then I struck marks off of it. It's one of those interesting things. There's no technical thing to say, right, it'll be a big issue. Sometimes it can really distract students from what they're doing, though. But it does keep things interesting when you realise a few things being thrown up there in the GAT and what students have thought they'd put in for that particular year.
Absolutely. Well, that's good to know. And lastly, to wrap up, I ask all my guests on the podcast this: what is something that you wish you knew when you were in year 11 and year 12? And it doesn't have to be about the GAT. It can be about absolutely anything.
I think for me, it would be that, that there's certain things that are challenging, and that there's certain things that are hard about year 12, and there's certain things that are great about VCE. For me personally, it would have been about probably a little bit of like, wake up and start doing some of the harder work now. I was probably one of those students who realised about 2.5 years into my uni degree, how to go about studying and working hard. And it was a little bit like that late wake-up call, like, oh, my gosh, all that stuff that my teachers have probably been saying to me in year 8, year 9, year 10 about, getting the most out of myself and studying and all that stuff took probably too long to click for me. And that, I tried in year 12 and I did okay and everything like that. But if I look back at it, I probably could have done, a bit better. And I know that lots of students feel that when they leave. So for me personally, it's going to be different, obviously, for everyone. Like you said, with what you asked, probably, switch on a little bit. I took a little bit longer than perhaps I should have to maybe pick that up. And the other thing, I guess, is, I think sometimes we have, because people sometimes, I guess, lack something else to say to kids that are doing year 12. They're like, oh, you're stressed and all that stuff. Don't let that be your default. I think when I look back at it, I loved, being in year 12 and everything, and all the freedom and everything that came with it, and that was exciting about where you were going. Don't forget, and it can be easy to forget, I guess, with COVID and all these types of things as well. Don't forget to enjoy it and look around and enjoy what, is the last year of secondary school and get the most out of it, because you won't be in a situation like that, ever again.
Absolutely. Some wise words there, Ben. Now, to end, I just wanted to mention to anyone listening, Ben has an incredible YouTube channel, Instagram page at the English Lab, where you can find him. He posts such great content about different English books, novels, also more content about the GAT, which you can check out. So I definitely recommend you checking them out. I will link them in the show notes, and they will also be on my Instagram too for you to find. But Ben, just to end, just tell us where the students can find you.
Yeah, so thanks for mentioning those things, Mia. We in 2020, I started a YouTube channel as a bit of a project and to help students that were sort of at home and things like that. And it's something I really enjoy doing. It's all completely free, obviously, with it being on YouTube. And the best part about it for me is that I still get to enjoy what I used to love doing, which was teaching Year 12 and all the different texts. So I try to choose a book from the Section A, texts, and put 4 or 5 videos up there about, right, have you looked at this scene in depth, or have you looked at these 10 quotes, and here's an overview, and here's a sample paragraph. So I do quite a bit of sample writing for students as well, I think, and they tend to respond really well to that. So, type in, the English Lab, and then your text name. Most of the really popular ones are there. There's also things on the comparatives as well, and there's different ways of thinking about it. And it can just be a different way for students to really get into it. And the other good thing about that, you can ask me questions there. I really make it, as part of the project, I really make it a goal of mine that if a student puts a really reasonable comment or question up there, I'll obviously get the email saying that it's there. I'll make an effort within a week or two to make sure I get on there and respond to that, sometimes quicker. But I want to make sure that students that are putting in that effort at home and so on and thinking, oh, actually, I might ask this guy this and get his opinion. I want to be able to do those things. And so, the Instagram is at VCE English 2021, and that's more directed just for students. And so there's little snippets of videos and pieces of advice, and it's another avenue where students can ask questions, really.
Awesome. Well, definitely check it out. And thank you once again for joining us today on the Student Space, Ben. I've loved the chat on the GAT. It's been so helpful. And I know if anyone's listening to this before the GAT, they'll get a lot out of it. So thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thanks very much, Mia. I've really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
If you like this episode or have any more questions, head over to our Instagram at the.studentspace. Now there is a full stop between the and student. And just remember, this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not provide any personal advice. Thank you for all your support, everyone. See you later.